All right, so we're talking about theology of violence and how we as Christian men can carry the burden of violence and how do we balance that with the mandate to love. And so we've kind of looked at some of the historicity of that, the command to rule the earth that God gave us in the garden, right after the garden. We looked at the eschatological, where when Jesus is coming back, he's going to be carrying a sword and providing judgment for the world. And we've also looked at where Christ showed that personally in the temple where he ran people out, the money changers. So we know that a good God can both be love and violent because he's demonstrated that in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. So just because Christ died on the cross did not change his nature. His nature is still one of love, but he's also, in a Trinitarian sense, was there in the Old Testament approving the destruction of Sodom and then also bringing back a sword with him when he comes to judge the world. And judgment in and of itself is a violent act. The act of distributing justice is a violent act, or else Christ wouldn't be carrying a sword with him. And when you look at Revelation and all the things that are poured out on the earth, the fire and all the destruction, those are violent acts that God has prophesied and designed and ordained. And so a loving God can still be violent and not compromise his character. And so if he can do that, he wants us to live like him. How do we as Christian men think about living peaceably in a violent world and making sure that we carry the capacity to react to that violence in an appropriate way? Well, one of the first things is I think that we are born with the DNA of a hero, and we were built to rescue. And I think that as long back as I can remember, as a young kid, I dreamed of being a hero and dreamed of doing something significant. That's one reason kids love, boys specifically, love military and policemen. They play those roles all the time. They want to watch those kind of movies. And even Jonathan, my 15-year-old, who is mentally challenged and has a lot of issues, but is 15 and operates more like a 6, 7-year-old, has those kind of values. And I remember, just 6 or 8 months ago, he looked at me and said, "Dad, I want to be a hero." And he loves Ninjaro and those ninjas, but he wants to be a hero. He wants to matter. He wants to rescue somebody and do something significant. So I think we're born with that DNA, and I think that DNA is a reflection of the one who made us. When you think about our descriptions of Christ, warrior, priest, and king, 2 of those 3 are inherently violent, inherently require violence in order to maintain that role of warrior and king. And even priest has an element of violence to it if you think about the sacrifices. So there's the blood sacrifices that the priest would carry out. So all 3 roles required Christ to carry some capacity for violence, but yet not violate his mandate of love. So and I think that the idea of me protecting my family is an inherent commitment to marriage and relationships. It's just a basic necessity of me saying, "I love you and I'm going to take care of you. You can trust me." And so there's a requirement of me being willing and able to protect my family. A couple of quotes. George Herbert said, "One sheath keeps another sheath, keeps another in the sheath. One sword keeps another in the sheath." And then Charles de Gaulle said, "The sword is the axis of the world, and its power is absolute." And as much as I dislike that last quote, I do think it's very true. So taking a life, I think that when we think about culture, there's some violence against innocence that's so brutal that society cannot sustain it or give permission to it without defiling itself. So as a culture, if we give permission and do not require some kind of penalty for doing violence to innocence, then that culture loses its own identity and becomes something very different. I think that sacrifice is central to who we are as Christians, and sacrifice in and of itself, the image of sacrifice, which is central to our identity as Christians, is violent in nature. And so it's interesting how God has chosen all these violent images. The cross, which is very violent, is a central icon for who we are as Christians. And so I think that there is some idea that we can get from God of an image of violence that is appropriate. And of course, Christ was the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. So the center of all reality for us is the cross. And God poured out judgment upon Christ, and Christ received it. And so God himself, the Father, distributed violence without defiling himself. He ordained that as a way to merge our relationship back with him and give us an opportunity to come into a loving relationship with him. And yet he distributed this violence without defiling himself. And Christ could have protected himself, but he chose not to out of faith. And I think so it will be for us at times too. We've got to be willing to dispense violence and yet at times receive violence and according to what it was required to be obedient to God. So I think we can defend our families. If somebody is trying to come into my home and harm my children, I don't have to defend them because I hate the person that's doing this. I can defend them because I love my family. And that love compels me to do whatever is required to protect them. So our motivation in defense is love and not hate. A couple things I want to think about as well, kind of setting this up. What's the difference between, to reflect back on a common topic right now, but Islam and Christianity. Both have been violent cultures in the past. Both cultures have demonstrated a propensity out of that religious fervor to be violent. But how can we contrast who Islam is and who Christianity is? And I think there's a couple of things. One is our prophet, our major prophet, has told us to love our enemy and has told us to love our neighbor, and that we've got to be required to give our life for the good of somebody else. And so when Christianity in its religious fervor has done violent acts, they have violated the word of their major prophet. Islam, when they've done violent acts, they fulfilled those mandates. Their prophet was violent, and their prophet commanded them to be violent and do violent things. And so they fulfill the word of their prophet when they're violent. We violate the commands of our prophet when we're violent. So I think there's two things. I think another thing that's of major significance and how we can demonstrate that we do not, the God of Allah and the God of Christianity are not the same. Allah is alone. He's the only God, and he's singular. And so out of that singularity, he created man, according to Islam, for service. It wasn't out of love, it was for service. And this is one reason that the will is so important, and Allah wills it, and they are willing to do things with that kind of fatalistic outlook on life. So Islam was created out of aloneness. It was created for the purpose of power and being able to rule. Those things are very clear in the Quran. When you look at Christianity, we've got a God of three who lived in a relationship of love and trust, mutual respect, mutual service, mutual support, transparency, intimacy. And they wanted to create man out of that love. And so they created man to be a partner in life. And so man could have a father-son, father-child kind of relationship, not creator and servant the way we see in Islam. And so out of the Trinity, we have this creation of love for the purpose of one of the creators dying for us, giving literally his life for us. And so we cannot, I don't think that we can at all say that the God of Allah, the God of Islam, and God the Father, the God of Christianity, are the same, because their DNA is different. Their character is different. Their natures are different. The nature of relationship in the Trinity and the nature of aloneness in Islam. And so I think it's a lot of people, want to try to equate Christianity and Islam and try to say that they're the same and that they're the same God, and that they both are flawed in the sense that they have enacted violence on other cultures. But I think it's important for you to point them back to that primary difference. When we've done it, we have violated the command and the character of Christ. And when they've done it, they fulfilled the law of their prophet. We've broken the law of our prophet, they fulfilled the law of their prophet. So I think that's very important to think about.
Last month, when you were talking about some of this, you said like when Peter took out the sword, it was Peter seeking to advance the kingdom outside of God's plan, and therefore it was unacceptable. It's not that the act of violence was unacceptable, it was the motivation. I'm trying to process what you were just saying, but in Islam, our God has a plan. We act according to it, and if we don't, then it's not acceptable. But Islam, what I'm hearing in their groups are, they can do it in the name of Allah, and Allah will take their manly efforts and use it and just include it and make it okay because they did it for the...
Yeah, because
Because I'm not able to put that in words. Does that make sense?
yeah, well, all they have is obedience. They don't have a way to be saved other than service. So and that's why they're so rigid and strict. In fact, Islam, the very language of Arabic has not evolved or changed in nearly 2,500 years. They speak now exactly the way they spoke then because they're afraid if they even change a word, that it will change the meaning of the Quran. So they're so rigid, and the number of times they pray a day, how they wash their hands, every single thing has to be followed exactly, or they're afraid of losing that promise of salvation. And whereas our relationship with God is much different. That's much different. So I think that's kind of what you're pointing to in a lot of ways is a fundamental difference in the way that we approach life. We approach life believing that life and relationships are the ultimate goal of life. They believe that serving Allah and bringing His rule upon this earth in an absolute way, where everybody is not invited into a relationship, but commanded to be in a relationship through the use of a sword. And Islam is one of the fastest growing religions in the world, but it's not through evangelism, it's through conquest. So I think and a lot of people point to the Crusades as a demonstration of the violence of Christianity, and I think there's some legitimacy to that. But we've got to realize too, if you go back and look at the history of Crusades, that happened at the end of 600 to 800 years of Islamic conquest, where almost all of the Western world was conquered. I think they had conquered about 75% of the world, and we were on the verge of collapse when we finally began to push back. So what we see, and if you look at the number of battles that Islam incurred all over the world versus the very strategic crusades, which we were trying to conquer and go back and get Israel back under control, you can see that there's a very different motivation. Our motivation wasn't to conquer the world in the name of Christ. Those crusades were very strategic and intended to break the back of Islam, which it did. So I think that you can look at a very different impulse in the Crusades versus the Islamic conquest that led up to the necessity for the Crusades. Did you have any more thoughts on that? I may not have gotten to what you were interested in asking. But
yeah, but it's not clear enough for me to ask. We'll figure it out.
All right. Well, we'll figure it out together.
I don't know if I understood this correctly, but I think I've been told before that with Islam, that even if they, assuming it's possible, do everything perfect as inscribed or prescribed or whatever it is there, that still they have no surety of.
Yeah, that's why Allah wills it is such a big. Whatever Allah determines is right. There is no real understanding of Allah other than command, and so they have no guarantee other than they feel in martyrdom they have much stronger guarantee. If they give us their life, destroying the enemy on His behalf, then there is a much stronger guarantee. So if you were consumed with the afterlife and wanted to make sure that you had eternal life, and you weren't sure that if you followed all the prescripts of the religion you were going to be saved, if we can use that word, and yet if you gave your life as a martyr, you would be, which one would you choose? So there's almost a predisposition to push people into martyrdom.
It seems like Allah's kind of whimsical.
He's very, very.
There, Allah wills it. Either they make up their own mind that Allah did, or they don't know.
Well, essentially, when you look at when you see the Kurds, or not the Kurds, but when you see a lot of being beheaded and killed, and they're just kneeling down, they're not fighting back, they've submitted because they believe this is God's will. So there's no need for me to fight against God's will. And so they kneel there, they walk down the line, boom, 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 shooting 30, 40 people in the head. I'd at least get up and run. I'm going to do something I would try to fight the guy to get his pistol. I would do something to try to save my life in the end, but none of them do. And it's because they have submitted to what they believe this is God's will, and I have no control of it. And so they Sherer that. And it's fatalism. I mean, it's exactly what it is. It's fatalism, and there's no hope. So.
If you'll forgive me for spending way too much time on Islam, but I'm curious about some things. Seeing the way that women are treated, and you just thinking about these concepts we just talked about, your opinion is draw. Why are so many people so drawn to this religion if there is no certainty and they're pretty much treated like crap under that?
That kind of goes into what I was just fixing to say. That could be why it is such a draw and why it is, because it takes the thinking out of it. You do this is what happens.
It's the same reason people are drawn to Calvinism. It's a set of rules, and rules are easy to follow.
Yes, exactly.
You don't have to have a relationship to hear God. There's rules. There's
Sheep.
something you got to do.
Well,
You do this, you do that.
I was
Hope
thinking
for the
that.
best on the end.
Well, and why do people do drugs? Why do people do a lot of things that end up taking their life? We can at least see this some semblance of pleasure in drugs, and that makes it's short term, but we can understand that capacity. But we live in the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age of confusion and disorientation, and not being able to distinguish between the truth and a lie. And then whether it's the Christians talking about Trump or us talking with the left, but I think it's permeated that spirit of confusion, and it has permeated the world. And I think that a lot of guys are looking for something solid, and for them, following rules gives them a sense of security. What gives us security? It's faith. It's trust. They don't have any trust in Allah, because he does whatever he wants to do. They have trust that if they follow the rules, then that makes Allah do what he's supposed to do. But even then, there's no real security. But I think it's just the ritualistic part of that, and ultimately I think it's the enemy confusing people, and it's the antithesis to who Christ is. So I don't know that I have a good answer for that, other than those are some things that kind of come to mind.
I think there's a lack of gospel being preached in those places too, because of the present culture. So there is no real.
Yeah, I've read articles. Yeah, I've read a lot of articles where there's a revivals going on, and you wonder how much of that is, evangelical preaching, or how much of it is truly happening. But there's got to be hope. And in the end, when you've seen your child, beheaded or an arm cut off, or somebody thrown off a roof, and you just see the absolute brutality, absolute disregard for humanity, and that's all you can say that it is, and that you've got to begin to wonder, is there something better than this? And so I hope and pray that the message of Christ is given out to those folks. And it's hard because my daughter said today, I want to be a military nurse, I want to be a missionary, and she's 14, and inside I'm thinking, dear God, don't send her, to Islam. To be a witness to them, but I don't have that right. She's not mine to claim, and that's a hard thing. That's a very hard thing. But I think that it's important for us as we think about violence to think about it in contrast to other cultures and other religions who support violence. So our violence comes out of love. It comes out of a passion to create safe cultures and safe places for people, where innocents and those who are weak, whether it be homeless or widows or children, are safe. And so the only thing that's going to stop violence is violence. I mean, it's sad to say that, but it's true. Violent men only respond to violence. Now, violent men can be redeemed out of love. They're only changed because of love, but they're only stopped because of violence. So we have to have a violence of goodness that stops their violence of evil, with the hope that they can be converted because of love. But love doesn't stop violence. If it did, Christ would not have been destroyed on the cross. He would not have been killed on the cross. And so destroyed is the wrong word, but he would not have been killed on the cross. But there was an evil generation of men who wanted to destroy him. And ultimately, his love changed their hearts. But if he was going to stop it, Peter had it right. It was only going to be through the use of a sword. So I believe that God has given us the sword to use in lieu of him not being here, but use it in the same nature that he would use it, and that is to create a culture here on earth that's safe and secure. So we do not initiate his kingdom here on earth, but we do create culture here on earth through the use of violence. So what he was saying to Peter is, Peter, you can't bring the kingdom down here to the earth by using violence. You can't do that. And so, because God's motivated primarily by love, violence is not intrinsic to the nature of the way the Father and Son and the Spirit live together. And so we can't use violence to bring that Trinity here, although the Trinity clearly is comfortable using violence in order to stop violence and to protect the lineage of Christ. One of the things I want to think about excuse me, is the difference between mindset and heart set. In self-defense and training, you hear this idea of mindset a lot, and that the main difference between us and a victim is going to be mindset. And those who succeed in a violent confrontation, they do because of the right mindset. So what are some things that you've heard related to a mindset that makes you successful in a violent confrontation? Think about a gunfight or a fist fight. What kind of mindset is going to help you succeed?
Determination, refusal to give in,
Straight up Christ.
Yeah.
to be dominant.
Yeah, absolutely. All those things are true. And if we don't have that mindset, we're not going to succeed, right? If we don't have those things you listed in our minds. Now, here's the tough thing is a criminal, when he starts to be violent against someone, that's not his first time being violent. And he comes to that act with the right mindset on what he believes is going to help him be successful. And so we are automatically, in some sense, at a disadvantage because this, more than likely for most people, would be the first time of a truly violent confrontation. A criminal who's violent has tended to be violent in the past, and he's comfortable in that role. And he's already made his mind up that that's what he's going to do. That's why if somebody comes in my home, I feel like if they know I'm home, they've already determined to be violent, or they want to come in my house when I'm home. And so I'm willing to approach them with a violent mindset because I feel like they've already made that determination coming into my house. So we understand mindset, and if we don't, we need to, on what helps us succeed in a violent confrontation. But what has to be coupled with that is a heart set. What's our heart going to be oriented to the person or the people that we've got to defend our families? And I don't think that's as easy for us. It's easier for me to get angry and out of that anger be violent. But and the scripture says, "Being angry, sin not." So there is the right capacity for us to be angry and not have violated that. But at the same time, when we see habitual sin, habitual violence, I think it's going to be much more difficult for us to maintain a pure heart as we're being confronted over and over and over again with people who are violent. I've got a friend of mine who's a guard in a prison, and it's very hard on him because he wants to help people. And so he tries to talk to these guys and tries to help these criminals that are in jail, who many of them have violent tendencies. And the problem is, though, as soon as he makes some connection with a guy, what happens to him? He gets shipped out of jail to prison, or he gets freed. And so his influence on that person is very little. And who feels this lot? The guy, he's got to start all over with. And so over and over again, day after day, he is confronted with a violent mindset of other people, antagonistic, and he can't stop it. There's no change in that. He's just going to have an unending parade of people who come in with that mindset. And imagine trying to protect your heart and your life against people who over and over and over again, even if you have 10 people, there's 100 that went out and a new 100 came in, you're starting over at day one again. That's very hard. It's one thing for me to keep my heart pure when I'm in a violent confrontation and afterwards making sure things are straight, but what do you have to do if you have to deal with it every day, like a military man or a policeman? or a guy who's working in a jail, or people who are living in Afghanistan or Iran or Iraq, where they see those things over and over. And if you stop these 10, there's going to be 100 more to take that place. And so our hearts have to be ready to endure that kind of oppression and that kind of conflict and still be pure and still be motivated by love. And it would be very easy for us not to be. I think I've told you this before, but I remember I was at the college, some of the professors, theology and Bible professors, did not like athletics very much, and they were always saying we're way too competitive because we wanted to win, and the coach wanted to win, the team wanted to win. They would say we're way too competitive, we need to be less competitive. And my response to them was, I don't think we need to be less competitive, I think we need to raise their characters up to support the weight of that competitive nature. That we need to grow people's character, not shrink their competitiveness. And so I think that in the church, because we don't really understand character development and we're scared of violence, we're scared of the competitive nature of men, that we've tried to shrink violence down to what's safe and controlled, rather than focus on building men up to bear the weight of a highly violent, highly competitive kind of environment. And so that's something I want you to think about too. What does God need to grow up in you to be able to bear the weight of the heaviness of being willing and being able to be violent?